Hello, good evening, and welcome to all viewers at home. We have a very special debate ahead of us. We shall be talking about Czech conservatism, and we are joined here tonight by very distinguished guests. We have with us tonight Mr. Roman Joch, philosopher of politics, director of the Občanský Institute, the Civic Institute, political commentator and translator. Mr. Joch, welcome.
Good evening.
Mr. Matyáš Zrno, journalist and publicist, editor-in-chief of Konzervativní noviny magazine. Good evening, Mr. Mr. Maciej Ruczaj, director of the Polish Institute in Prague, political scientist and publicist.
Dobry wieczór.
And Mr. Paweł Ukielski, political scientist and historian, the deputy director of the Warsaw Rising Museum and the author of the recently published book Memory of Poland, Memory of Neighbors, Memory of Europe on Politics of History. Good evening.
Hello, good evening.
And thank you very much for being with us tonight. And before we begin, I would like to thank our partners at Block Press for broadcasting this debate. And this meeting was co-financed as a public task by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland in the Polish-Czech Forum 2020 program. And I would like to start with a sort of an introductory question addressed to Mr. Maciej Ruczaj. In your experience as the director of the Polish Institute in Prague, would you say that there is perhaps a sort of a common language that both Poles and Czechs readily understand? Not as much as what we have in common, because after all, our languages have so much in common, yet here we are speaking English. But what I mean is, what things do evoke similar emotions in both our nations and similar sentiments, reactions, in your professional experience?
Okay. First of all, sorry, excuse my English. I'm always kind of get a strange feeling when Poles and Czechs are discussing together in English, but it's our fate, I think. So excuse my English for now. But the second just preliminary remark is I would like to thank Teologia Polityczna for launching the project of kind of analysis of Czech conservatism from Polish perspective. I think it's very useful to deal with different aspects of Czechness with other aspects than we are used to in Poland, because the perspective from the right is not so common in the Polish debate about who are the Czechs. So thank you very much for this. As to your question, my passion is history, so I'm always trying to answer via history. And the easiest answer would be that we have very little in common, that this language similarity of our languages is a kind of illusion, or creates a kind of illusion of closeness. But in reality, our kind of trajectories of our history moved in completely different directions just right from the beginning. When in 10th, 11th century, the Czechs have chosen the path of being a part of Roman Empire, and the Poles, their leaders, choose the path of independence, let's call it. And from this very beginning, Czechs choosing emperor, Poles choosing pope, and so on, we moved in different directions, let's call it. And the first moment when we were back together after 10th century was during the communism, actually, where our fates were united for the first time since Middle Ages, actually. And this experience of communism is our common heritage between Poles and Czechs. And this is the experience, the shared sentiment we can build something on. Of course, this memory is traumatic, and this trauma is our common heritage. But at the same time, I think it shows the Poles and Czechs some basic values we should stick to, especially freedom, especially some kind of distrust to ideologies, because we had those, state-imposed ideology for half a century, and now we are more, or it's more difficult to convince us that we should adopt some other one. And of course, there is this common or shared feeling of being a part of the West with capital W, but the West which was kidnapped by the totalitarian regimes, and we were longing for a long time. We were longing to be reunited with this mythical Western world. And this sentiment is something that unites the elites of both our countries, and which gave the direction to our countries after 1989. And just to finish, probably this longing for the mythical West, if we talk about the conservative part of the political debate, was to some extent exchanged by the feeling of disappointment, let's call it, by the feeling that the West we were longing for is no longer existing, or it's somewhere hidden, and we are now confronted with something else which we didn't expect it. And those are probably the major kind of political sentiments that I find similar on both sides of our borders.
Thank you, Mr. Ruczaj. There were several issues there that I believe we shall be getting back soon in our conversation. So now I would like to dive straight in into our main subject of the evening, to the Czech conservatism itself. So I would like now to ask Mr. Zrno to answer my question, because I think it would be very interesting to see if the Czech conservatism after the end of the communist regime had a similar dynamics of development as it had in Poland. Because here, after the fall of communism, conservatives have found themselves in a sort of an awkward position, really, because there was, I think, precious little to conserve, and it was urgently needed to define themselves on a political spectrum, or redefine. And they chose, for example, to look deeper at Polish traditions to seek solutions for modern conservatism. And I was wondering how did it look like in Czechia after communism, Mr. Zrno?
Well, when you said back in the 1989 or 1990 the conservatives, then people still thought about the, let's say, old school conservative group in the Politburo of the Communist Party. Those were those we considered conservatives. The general public considered to be conservatives. That had a very bad meaning because, like Gorbachev was the moderate, but Gustav Husák, the last president of the communist Czechoslovakia, he was conservative. That was what people considered to be conservative at the time. But let's go to the roots of the question. If there was anything to conserve in, let's say, Czech political thinking, and I don't think so. There is not a strong tradition of Czech political conservatism, so there was not much to conserve, and I would call the Czech conservatism basically a movement of discontinuity, a movement that basically was rooted in foreign Anglo-Saxon conservatism and Anglo-Saxon ideas that were transferred to Czech political reality and the Czech political thinking. When you think about the big persons of Czech political philosophy or political praxis back in the 90s or beginning of 20th century, first half of 20th century, you don't really find conservatives there. The names like František Palacký, Rieger, Masaryk, the first president of independent Czechoslovakia, they were definitely not conservatives. They were, more or less liberals. Those who were conservatives were quite few, and they were basically on the outskirts of political life. Some rather obscure figures like Ladislav Jehlička, for example. If you would ask me whom should the conservatives, whose picture should the conservatives put on the wall of a room where they are meeting, the question is probably no one. I mean, we don't really have some figure that we would consider to be some sort of intellectual father of Czech conservatism. Most probably the Czech conservatives in the dissent back in the 70s or 80s would put President Masaryk on the wall, because even that he was basically liberal and definitely not conservative, he was some sort of symbol of democratic Czechoslovakia. This is one important point, after the World War II, in the short 3 years period of limited democracy, there was not even single conservative party allowed to continue its existence, even limited existence. Only the Christian Democrats, they were called the People's Party, were, let's say, non-socialist party, but even they were very soft non-socialist. I mean, there was no resistance towards, for example, nationalization of the Czech industry of every factory over 50 employees. Absolutely no resistance. There was no resistance toward this limiting of political life for 4 parties. 3 of them were socialist: the National Socialists, the Social Democrats, and the Communists. We were the only party in Europe where the Communist Party was elected by the majority of the Czechs in the at least partly free elections in 1946. The intellectuals in Czech lands, more in Czech than in Slovak part of Czechoslovakia, were in most cases leftist, socialist, and many of them straightforward communist. So even the intellectual tradition was not conservative. There were some, but the majority, I would say, was left-wing. Then the resistance against the regime. I mean, you also don't find exactly too many conservatives. In many cases, the resistance was non-ideological. There was also left-wing resistance. And I would say that generally most of the people would pretty much be happy with some sort of democratic socialism, as the moderates in the Communist Party tried in the spring of 1968, the socialism with human face, so to say. And even among the dissidents in the 70s and the 80s, the majority were people who were either members or who used to be members of the Communist Party, and they were thrown out in the purges after the Prague Spring, after the Soviet invasion in 1968. So most of them would still, agree with some sort of democratic socialism. So the fact that there was a small group of dissidents in the 70s who were, looking like in the darkness, look for some sort of light, for something different, some new ideas, new inputs. They were not satisfied with the traditional answers of more liberal socialism. And they were looking for new answers, and they found it in the Anglo-Saxon conservatism. And those were people like Pavel Bratinka, Alexander Kroupa, Daniel Kroupa, Václav Benda, and others. But they were minority in the dissent, and and we owe a lot to Roger Scruton, the British conservative philosopher, and many other professions he played in his life, who was visiting Czechoslovakia from the 70s until he was deported, and whose lectures and whose intellectual and practical support with smuggling the books and so on pretty much helped to spread the ideas of the Anglo-Saxon conservatism in, especially among the Czechs, much less among the Slovaks, to be frank. In Slovakia, the conservatism was more connected to Catholic Church and to nationalism, to national issue. I mean, with Czechs, you know, we are very soft on nationalism, and we pretty much adopted this pragmatic Anglo-Saxon conservatism as presented by Roger Scruton. And this is something I consider almost to be a miracle, that this small group of dissidents succeeded in absorbing these ideas, spreading these ideas, and actually they played a very important role back in the 90s in creating the new independent and democratic Czechoslovakia, both in terms of our constitutional system, economical reform, and other aspects of life. That was, I would say, a unique window of opportunity in Czech history and the Czech political life, what happened in the 90s with the influence of these people and Anglo-Saxon conservatism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zrno. And now I would like to address Mr. Paweł Ukielski, because I think it would be interesting to compare Czech and Polish approaches to history. Because on one hand, one may argue that our historical experiences in the 20th century are to some extent, in a broadest picture, similar, but the differences are there, and they are quite crucial. And there is so my question is, to what extent do we tell the same story? How do we do that? How do we choose to share our history with the world and to ourselves?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation for the debate. Well, Maciej already said that our common experience is not that common. And we could argue, if we could find some more common points, I would say that yes, but of course it was great synthesis of 1,000 years of common existence in the Central Europe. So basically, in 20th century, those similarities were bigger than in any other century. Definitely, half of the century of totalitarian regimes is something in common in both cases, Polish and Czech or Czechoslovak ones. Second thing, I would say that something also to some extent in common was the moment of regaining independence. At the end of the First World War, of course, during the Habsburg monarchy, there were strong clashes between Poles and Czechs fighting for their better position within the state. However, in 1918, we have this well-known example, or not that known that it deserves, of common speech of Masaryk and Paderewski in Carnegie Hall in September 1918. But soon, because we have two countries that emerged and they should be interested in keeping status quo in Europe after 1918. But they were not cooperating in that manner. They were rather in conflict, and they were treating each other as a season state. So this is something that could be common, but it was not. And the whole period of interwar period was not that common in our history. It was rather a history of conflict. So of course, we have similarities, but we have huge differences, deeply rooted. For example, if we have three main denominators of Czech thinking about, or Czech identity. We have Slavism or pan-Slavism to some extent, for a long time very strongly existent in Bohemia. It was practically non-existent in Poland, where it was treated as Russian imperialist ideology. Second, resistance to the German element after a huge period of almost total Germanization of Bohemia. And then third, anti-Catholicism. So if we have those three very strong denominators from the 20th century, we can see that two of them are completely opposite to Polish denominators. So this shows that this story is not that very common as we sometimes tend to believe, especially nowadays. But on the other hand, we have common experience of Nazi occupation, German occupation. Of course, those occupations differed, but still, for both nations, they were huge trauma, and it is well remembered in both societies. Second thing is, of course, communism and Soviet rule, and in Czech situation, for example, the year 1968 diminished, for example, meaning of those Slavic ideology. After the invasion of the Soviet and, of course, the Warsaw Pact invasion on Czechoslovakia, those pro-Russian or pro-Slavic sympathies were really limited very much. And how do we explain our history now, and what do we have in common? There is tendency of thinking that Poles are the nation that is really deeply rooted in a history, that is discussing its history, and Czechs are not. This stereotype is to some extent probably right, but I would say that history plays much greater role in Czech common thinking than it is shown. Of course, the state almost left it alone after regaining independence. We will come back to this probably later when we will discuss the questions of politics of memory or historical policy in the Czech Republic. But some debates are still ongoing, and they are also quite hot in the Czech Republic. But for example, if we take into consideration movies, we can see that there are many movies dealing with history, with the communist past, both in Poland and in the Czech Republic. I would say that Poles even envy Czechs movies that are telling their story. For example, Dark Blue World, that is very often told as a good example how to tell the story to the world. We envy Czechs that they were able to convince the world that Lidice case is one of the most important cases to deal with, and Polish tragedies during the Second World War are not. So many common traces are also used in the talking about history. The communist legacy is one of the topics that are connecting us very strongly. There are Czech and Polish institutions, together with institutions from many other countries, gathered in the platform of European memory and conscience, that are fighting for taking the Central European experience into the main narrative line of Europe, especially taking into full consideration this communist or post-communist legacy. So the experiences are on many fields different. The identity is on very fields different, but there are definitely certain common points that are combining us together, while making us cooperate, and where we can use our common history to be told abroad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ukielski. And now we have a sort of a background in historical perspective of Czech conservatism. And now I would like to ask Mr. Roman Joch about the values and perhaps the appeal of conservatism in modern Czechia. What is the appeal of conservative politics in your country today? Or to put it simply, why a Czech citizen votes for a conservative candidate, and what does he or she expect him or her to do? And what do Czech conservatives themselves emphasize as their political, as the essential political position? Mr. Joch.
Thank you, and good evening once again. I agree with what has already been said by fellow speakers and participants. I would try to summarize that the Czech conservatism after 1989 has been less religious and less nationalistic than the fellow conservatisms in Poland, Hungary, and even Slovakia. It was more civic-minded, more pragmatic, more trying to imitate British and American conservatism. Czech self-identified conservatives admired both President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher in the 80s. They were the main inspiration why they adopted the name or the label conservatism. Secondly, and it is in fact implied by the fact of admiration for Anglo-American conservatism, Czech conservatives have always been more classical liberal, especially in their economic views, than other Central European conservatives in post-communist countries. So one of the first values of Czech self-identified conservatives was anti-socialism, not only anti-communism or anti-totalitarianism. The conviction was that in 1939, there was a totalitarian interruption, abortion, if you will, of a normal course of life, first by Nazis and then by communists. And the return to normalcy, to real normalcy, to the West as a civilization where we had always belonged in the past, but were interrupted and extirpated from the West by Nazis and communists, must mean that we should reverse not only totalitarian political rule, but even a socialist economic order. So one of the first causes of Czech conservatives was privatization of properties nationalized by the old communist regime. Secondly, not controversial among both conservatives, classical liberals, and even some social democrats was the rule of law, establishing once again rule of law, independent judiciary, and quite significant role of the Constitutional Court. However, what was quite conservative or supported by the political right in those years of the 90s of the 20th century was a bicameral parliament. People on the left mostly preferred a unicameral parliament. That was not possible because we were a Czechoslovak federation. So the Czechoslovak Federal Assembly already had two chambers. However, after the split of Czechoslovakia, they were Czech conservatives who have written into Czech constitution that the Czech parliament should be bicameral, the deputies chamber and the Senate. Few people considered themselves conservatives in those times. Much more would claim themselves to be classical liberals, with some justice. However, now, those, let us say, 30 years after the fall of communism, many of those former classical liberals now prefer to call themselves conservatives. Because first, they see a reason what to conserve. The free society established in November 1989 and years following November 1989. So now they see that they have achieved to establish something valuable, something worth preserving. And that's the free society. However, they now see some dangers or threats to the tolerant, free, democratic society. And those threats are coming from three sides of the world. From the West, it is ideological threat of an ideology which describes themselves, and we describe it as progressivism or left liberalism, leftist cultural moral liberalism, which does not demand from us only tolerance. We would be fine from tolerance, with tolerance, and would like to impose on us such new ideas like same-sex marriage. Most of Czech conservatives were quite tolerant in personal attitudes, so cohabitation of persons of the same sex was not a political issue. But something different is an idea that we should cohabitation or relationship between two persons of the same sex considered to be a marriage. For many, even classical liberals who now describe themselves as conservatives, is a radical step, is an idea too radical for our society. It goes beyond tolerance and tries to convince us that we must give our assent to something, to some label which we are not accustomed to. So another problematic ideas coming from the West, from Western Europe, are ideas of so-called hate speech. So an idea to suppress political conversation, freedom of speech, freedom of discussion, by labeling some unpleasant opinions as hate speech, which should be outside the protection of the law guaranteeing us our constitutional right to free speech. So those who considered 90s as a golden age of freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, now fear that the trend coming from the West is in favor of restricting our freedom of speech. Still, we think that in Czech society or in the whole of Central Europe, the freedom of speech, I mean not only legal freedom of speech, but social freedom of speech, of a courage of people to openly proclaim their views, is much higher than, for example, in Germany or in Britain. Now the criminal laws in Britain are quite tough against so-called hate speech. So these conservatives, if you ask them, would claim that yes, we are trying to conserve our free society. We see another threat from the East, and that's a resurgence of neo-imperialist, newly aggressive Russia under incumbent President Putin. Most Czechs think that between us, Czech Republic, and Russia are enough borders, so we are quite safe. However, the Russian attempts to undermine our societies could be more hidden and more subtle than just the Russian army crossing borders. And of course, in recent years, in the last 5 years, many people were worried by the massive immigration from North Africa, from Middle East, and by the idea advocated by many progressives that we have no other choice but must accept those immigrants, that our people, our citizens, should not express their views by laws on immigration, whom we should, under what conditions, welcome as legal residents in our countries. So that immigration was perceived by many as something like a natural wave, a tidal wave, and we as human persons have no right, neither right nor any possibility to stop it or even to reverse it. And many people, not only self-identified conservatives, but I mean ordinary citizens, now think that that's not okay, that not we citizens will decide on the future of our country, but foreigners should decide on the future of our country. So there emerged something like a popular conservatism among the people, not intellectual, but popular. And finally, eventually, there were some people who considered themselves to be conservatives already in late 80s or early 90s. Some of them were Christian Democrats around former late dissident Václav Benda. He was self-proclaimed Christian conservative, but they were just one stream in the Czech anti-communist descent, not the most powerful, but with some considerable intellectual influence. And then there was those others who were not explicitly Christian conservatives, but as I have said, they admired Anglo-Saxon, American, and British conservatism. For example, there were two main influences. One was the person already mentioned, late Sir Roger Scruton, who visited regularly Czechoslovakia since 1979 till 1985. Then he was expelled by the state secret police, communist police from Czechoslovakia, and was allowed to return only after the fall of communism in 1990. But those 5-6 years, 1979 until 1985, established many friendships, and many Czechs who, before meeting Scruton, did not consider themselves to be conservatives, just liked his views and realized if that was conservatism, so perhaps I was a conservative too. Second influence was the American conservatism group of people around Pavel Bratinka, the founder of the Civic Institute, knew that Bratinka himself, as a university student in 1965, and during the whole those years till the Velvet Revolution, as a university student, then as a scientist, then as a cleaner in subway, in the metro, because he was not allowed to be nuclear physicist. He was a nuclear physicist by education, so he was a cleaner. He visited the library of the American embassy, which was open to Czechoslovak citizens, and he read one American conservative magazine there, National Review. So he was a regular reader of National Review since 1965, and a commentary magazine in the 70s. So he had a direct source of ideas advocated in America by American conservatives. So Scruton as a representative of British conservatism, and American magazines like National Review and Commentary as expressing American kind of conservatism. Those were the influences on some of Czech conservatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joch. Now I would like to move back to the question of the politics of history, of politics of memory, and to Mr. Paweł Ukielski. You are observing closely what the tendencies that the Czech politics are moving to. And I wonder, would you say that that history plays an important role in Czech politics? And if so, how do historical debates influence politics? And how are those debates perceived by the society? Are there vivid reactions to those debates that we can observe in Poland, for example?
Thank you very much. Of course, as already have been said, we differ a lot. So also the discussions are different. But I would still argue that this remembrance is somehow important from the very beginning, but it was changing in time. So in the beginning, the most crucial question was settling accounts with the communist past. So the question of justice. In first years of 1990s, Czechoslovakia, then the Czech Republic, issued a lot of laws that were aiming on settling with the past, returning justice, etc., etc. The term lustration was in fact invented in Czechoslovakia. So it was where it appeared for the first time in this context. And what is also very important from Polish point of view, this term meant something more than it does in Poland. So in Poland, it is only the need of each person that is trying to get some high-ranked post in the state administration or chosen post, and if even that person collaborated with the communist regime, it has to admit, he or she has to admit it, and no punishment. In the Czechoslovakia, then in the Czech Republic, this law was also containing a certain part of decommunization question. It means certain officials of the communist regime were banned from being on top positions in the democratic country. So this is one remark. Second was, I would refer to what Roman Joch said, that the classical liberals were very strong in the beginning of the independence, which means that their belief is that state has nothing to do with the remembrance, or not much to do with remembrance. So the classical liberal thought that this is the rather private issue. So everyone deals with it. And therefore, this was rather the domain of NGOs in the beginning, dealing with the past, like, I don't know, the postbellum or similar institutions that were gathering documents, oral histories, etc., etc. So this is the second part, because on the one hand, the liberals were not interested that state should take care of those topics. On the other, the leftists were certainly also not interested in that. So no historical museums, no institutions were established for many years. The first state institution, I would say, is the Institute for Studies of Totalitarian Regimes. It was established several years after Polish IPN was already established, and it was also preceded by a huge debate about even the name. So the first proposal was that it should be named as in Poland, so Institute of National Remembrance or National Memory, but there was huge resistance against the formulation National Remembrance, and therefore the name is Institute for Studies of Totalitarian Regimes. So this is the second remark. The third remark is that definitely in the last few years we can see some changes. The National Museum, which in Czech Republic is not, as in Poland, the art museum, but it deals with the history, is completely reshaping its exhibition. The renovation of building, the reshaping of the exhibition lasts for several years. It should be finished in few next years. Some other modern museums are planned. For example, Museum of the Memory of 20th Century. As a part of the National Museum was also created Jan Palach's house in Všetati. So there are some symptoms that, and of course, also in state documents, the need of commemorations, etc., started to appear in last few years. So we can see slight change in this way of thinking, and probably the last clash with the Russian Federation about the Koniev statue can make this process quicker, because I think Czech authorities were surprised with a very strong Russian reaction, and even such a very pro-Russian politician as Miloš Zeman reacted not for the Koniev statue, but for the comments of Russians towards the commemoration of Soviet invasion. So even he was reacted very sharply on Russian statements. So probably this clash with Russia can also make this process quicker. One quite interesting distinguished change also was made in thinking about the exhumations in Diablice Cemetery. The debate started somehow, but here we can see probably also this difference between Poland and the Czech Republic. In Poland, in the middle, nobody criticized spending a lot of money on exhumations, then the identification process, etc. When I was interviewed on that topic by a Czech journalist, I was frequently asked, why should we spend so much money on that issue? Those people are dead, they are buried, so why should we spend money? Maybe the difference is that attitude towards these religious questions, and that's why in Poland, in fact, this question did not appear, and in the Czech Republic, it appeared quite strongly. So there are big differences in the politics of memory, politics of history. There are some similarities. I would say that I presume that in the next years on that field quite a lot in the Czech Republic can happen.
Thank you very much for that remarks, Mr. Ukielski. And now I would like to ask Mr. Maciej Ruczaj about the dynamics and well, the nature of contemporary Polish-Czech relations on a shall we say cultural and level that we can observe today, because as you said in the beginning, that we have a lot to learn about ourselves. And for example, one of those things you mentioned, the perspective of Czech conservatives, which we are hopefully doing now. But would you say that there is a sort of a natural, organic, as it were, tendency to I don't know, to try to learn about each other in both Polish and Czech sides? Is there a sort of a magnetism, if that's not perhaps the perfect word, but it may do the job here? How would you describe that situation?
Well, it's very difficult to talk about such general issues like national stereotypes and national perceptions and attraction between the nations, because nations are they are made of different parts. And I would say that in terms of Polish-Czech relations, there are definitely segments of Polish and Czech society who feel very deep attraction to the other. But the problem is that there are probably different sections that they don't meet at the end. Because in terms of Czech perception of Poland, I always found interesting that there is a deep, or a kind of admiration towards Polish, let's say, Czechs call it that Poles are a proud nation, that the Poles are eager to fight for their rights, and they are eager to stand up even against the more powerful enemies. It's a kind of very romantic view of Polishness and Polish history, which is surprisingly common in the Czech context. So that's probably this something which is attractive in Polishness for some part of Czech society, and it was it was preserved in the memory of solidarity and John Paul II and so on. On the other hand, what attracts a large segment of Polish society to Czechness is a myth of Czech liberalism, of Czech almost permissivism, let's call it, that many Poles who are tired with Polishness, tired with our adherence to this romantic tradition I just mentioned, they perceive the Czechs as the nation who is free of this romantic burden. So they're exactly the two groups that won't meet at the end. So yeah, the attraction exists, but it's probably directed to in a different ways. I would say that the danger, because of course our societies in the last 30 years, they have a lot of possibilities to meet each other, really meet each other. There are no borders now in Central Europe, and therefore let's say the level of knowledge of each other is rising, which is always helpful in fighting this stereotypes. But at the same time, I would say that there is a danger that those stereotypes would be backed by the forces of cultural wars, which are happening now all over the Western world, because this different perceptions of Polishness and Czechness are very easily manipulated into the two sides of the barricades of the cultural wars. So just to put it straightforwardly, the liberal Czechs now perceives Poles as the stronghold of nationalism and religious bigotry, and at the same time the liberal Poles would perceive Czechs as this as a nation which is as a whole on the bright side of the struggle, the liberal side of the struggle, which is a huge oversimplification on both sides, and a dangerous oversimplification, because it puts the relation between the nations into the pattern of the internal cultural war, which is happening in both of the countries. And it is very dangerous to our relations and to our mutual perception to allow those divisions of cultural wars to affect our perception of each other as a nation. Yeah, and because of course when you come, let's say, to this oversimplified view, you would discover that Czechs themselves have their own variety of nationalism, which is only different from the Polish, that they've got their own variety of conservatism, but it manifests itself in a different ways than the Polish one. So yeah, most important thing is to keep in mind the bigger picture and to keep in mind the complexness of this picture, and not to let the logic of the war between different ideologies to dominate the relations between us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruczaj. And now I would like to go once again into the subject of influences that have impacted the development of modern Czech conservatism. Because Mr. Joch, you have mentioned and emphasized the influence of Roger Scruton and his well-known friendship with Czech intellectuals and dissidents, and with him the whole tradition of Anglo-Saxon conservatism. But I'm wondering how did that influence and that perception of a certain set of solutions that Scruton proposes for his own culture, in this case British or English, how was it transformed to fit the Czech context? If you could possibly comment on that issue.
There are several aspects of Roger Scruton's thought which have resonated with Czech conservative intellectuals. The first one was his uncompromising anti-communism. I know that sometimes in summer of 1989, so before the fall of communism, both Roger Scruton and Czech conservative intellectual Pavel Bratinka were invited to a conference in Florence, Italy, attended by many Western European intellectuals and professors. Those two were the only two radical anti-communists. All other Western European good professors didn't share, as they view it, the obsession with anti-communism. So Roger Scruton was perceived as a Westerner who completely understood the evil of communism. Even Scruton later, after the fall of communism, when he was asked by Czech journalists whether the experience of visiting Prague and Brno and Bratislava during communist years, whether it changed anything in his views on conservatism. And his answer was, well, before visiting communist countries, I underestimated the existence of devil. Roger Scruton perhaps was not too religious thinker, but he perceived that the totalitarian gray brutality was a touch of devil. And that, of course, was the same view of Czech, especially conservative dissidents, anti-communist dissidents. Secondly, his focus on rule of law, that the basic necessary, not sufficient, but necessary condition of any just society is a rule of law. Thirdly, his focus on civil associations, that there are many social and even culturally desirable tasks which should be fulfilled not by state power institutions, but by people themselves in their associations. And eventually and lastly, and that's happening just now in the last years and months, there is a renewed interest in Roger Scruton as an environmentalist thinker. He was a conservative environmentalist. He was not radical environmentalist, not leftist environmentalist. He loved nature. He was a farmer. And he wrote many essays, and I believe at least 2 books on the conservative protection of nature, of environment. And now when we have radical environmentalists in charge in the European Commission, or in many Western European countries like Germany, or in the Democratic Party of the United States, those Czech conservatives who were quite, let us say, not interested in any protection and conservation of the nature, because they were good liberals, good pro-capitalist liberals. So business and industry must be supported at any price. Now they know that the classical liberal answer that the free market will solve everything would be not sufficient, and they would lose voters if they do not offer them a conservative agenda for conservation and protection of nature. And Roger Scruton is perhaps the most influential among conservative thinkers who thought seriously, deeply and seriously, about conservative protection of environment. So I would say that this fourth legacy, which is being just now by, I know many students at universities who are going to write their thesis on conservative protection of nature. And of course, the main source of authority and wisdom would be especially Roger Scruton for them.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And lastly, I would like to address Mr. Matyáš Zrno as to the challenges and perspectives of current Czech conservatism. Would you try to prognosticate its intellectual and political influence, whether it is still on the rise or it has been pushed into more defensive positions? And especially, what about the younger generation? How do they embrace or not the conservative agenda, Mr. Zrno?
Well, we heard a lot about how important for the Czech conservatism was the Anglo-Saxon inspiration, the Reaganist, Thatcherist approach. Back in the 90s, it was like Margaret Thatcher and her economic reform was, the ultimate goal. Hayek and Mises were being read like a Bible. Free market was an extremely popular and important issue. This has changed a bit. I mean, while the young people back in the 90s read Hayek, the current young conservatives are probably sharing memes with Donald Trump, which is definitely a different thing. While, of course, the other young people are absolutely absorbing the new progressive ideas from the West, or these, intersectionalist, progressive, ecological, gender-related issues. On the other hand, we have an important development among some who were classical liberals and who turned conservatives, and even Catholics, like former Prime Minister Topolánek, former Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Vondra, who was also a former dissident. But I don't know if this is rather an issue of age of these gentlemen and then some sort of social atmosphere. But what is definitely important is that the West as such, and especially the United States, is losing its attractiveness, its gravity. I mean, United States and generally, Western Europe, that was unquestioned symbol back in the 90s. That was what we wanted to look like. And due to the progressive wave, due to things we see in the United States, we see in UK, we see in France and Germany, all the way from immigration, terrorist attacks, transgender issues, totally illogical for most of the population. BLM, the Black Lives Matter, definitely. That's something that is doing so much on degrading the gravity of the West. So the new conservatives don't look that much to the West, to United States. They are also much more Eurosceptical than it used to be the case in the 90s. I think they instinctively and, in my opinion, correctly see that many of these progressive ideas are being fueled by European institutions, European funds, and so on. In terms of practical policies now in Czech Republic, we live in the time where the political ideologies are not that attractive anymore. Those big issues like, you know, transatlantic connection, us being in the West, Euro-Atlantic connection, being in the NATO, and so on, does not really have the spirit, so to say, that it used to have in the 90s. And the current most important politician is the Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, who rules in an absolutely pragmatic way. I mean, he has no ideology at all. He's changing his opinion every day according to the latest public opinion research results. And he's succeeding in controlling the political scape with 25 to 30% of the votes, which is by far the most in Czech political system. So it's a big challenge how to address this from the conservative right, and it's a big issue for the main right-wing party, the Civic Democratic Party, ODS, that turned, I would say, more conservative now that it used to be back in the 90s, at least in the values and ethical values and cultural issues. If they should join their hands with, let's say, smaller liberal but anti-Babiš parties like the Top 09, which is a small, let's say, economically liberal, culturally more left-wing, almost progressive party, or with Christian Democrats who are, let's say, less Christian democratic than probably Polish public would expect, and definitely very pro-EU. That's always this dilemma of political coalitions. You need to have partners in order to beat the biggest enemy, but you lose part of your identity with having partners who are different. Let's say pro-EU, pro-Euro, pro-adopting Euro, more pro-EU Green Deal, and so on. On the other hand, those tendencies in the West, especially the migration crisis in 2015, in lesser case, all those progressive tendencies that we know from the West, they created some sort of primitive conservatives or populist conservatives, or sometimes I would even say socialist conservatives. People who are definitely not interested in some free market ideas, who definitely have no deeper ideas about what conservatism is about, but they are just afraid of these tendencies. They are afraid of Islamic migration. They are afraid of these crazy, gender tendencies. I'm not talking about it exactly in terms of an organized political movement or political party, but we see these tendencies in many of the political parties, even those that are left wing. Suddenly in Czech Republic, you hear people talk about traditional values or even Christian values from people you would never ever expect to hear that. I mean, they still, in my opinion, have not much idea what they are talking about. They don't exactly know what they are for, but they definitely know what they are against. They don't want Islamic immigration. That's the basic thing, and they don't want crazy progressivist ideas from the West. The question is now whether this is much less intellectual conservatism, or I would say even absolutely unintellectual conservatism, is a hope, or whether it's a road to darkness, so to say. Whether we should try to integrate these people in hope that they will strengthen the conservative movement, or whether they will destroy the conservatism from inside. And that's a question I don't really have a clear answer yet.
Thank you very much for that comments, Mr. Zrno. And at this point, I would like to end today's meeting, and that is all we have time for tonight. Many thanks to our guests today, Mr. Roman Joch, Mr. Matyáš Zrno, Mr. Maciej Ruczaj, and Mr. Paweł Ukielski.
Thank you.
I also thank the Block Press service for broadcasting our debates, and especially our sponsors at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Poland for funding this event in the Polish-Czech Forum 2020 program. Thank you very much for your attention, and we shall hopefully see you soon in our coming events here at Political Theology. Good night.